Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Mainstream Modular, a podcast from Guerdon Modular. I'm your host, Tyler Kern. Thanks so much for joining us for another episode of the show. Today, we're talking about a specific project. It's the Burlingame Ranch Phase 3 project, and we're going to be diving in and talking about all of this with Weston Bierma. He is a modular consultant. You're going to hear so much more about what he does and what he's done with this particular project and his decision-making process and so much more here on the podcast today. So we're thrilled to welcome Weston on with us. Weston, thanks so much for joining us here on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Tyler.
Absolutely. So, Weston, I teased a little bit more about your background there in the introduction. So tell us a little bit more about your background, what you do, and how you got involved in modular construction in the first place.
Sure. So my background really came from the general contracting world. And about 5 years ago, I did a project under R.A. Nelson for the town of Vail. It was 32 units of deed-restricted housing in West Vail. These 32 units, we worked with the town and turned out we were going to take this modular path. So after completing that project, I really saw an opportunity that this was going to be the future of construction. And from that point forward, I really just went all in on modular and learned as much as I could about it, took on any project I could. And here we are several years later and several hundred units later, doing a pretty large scale project for City of Aspen as the final phase of Burlingame.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I can't wait to kind of dive a little bit more into that. So tell us about some of the details of this particular project, about Burlingame Ranch Phase 3. Tell us a little bit more just about the particulars, about the number of units and the purpose behind this project.
Burlingame Phase 3 is the final build-out of a planned unit development for City of Aspen. It's comprised of 8 buildings, 79 units, about 88,000 gross square feet in this project. And it's a fully sprinkled NFPA 13 project. These buildings are on a difficult site, some really crummy soils in areas, big retaining wall cut, and kind of a tricky site to work.
When it comes to those tricky aspects, what sorts of maybe different kind of planning allowances did you make as a result of that? You know, obviously, like kind of where you're located in Aspen is going to mean that there's going to be particulars to this project that are unique to that city, to that spot, right? So what did you have to take into account when it came to this project because it's in Aspen?
Yeah, so this particular project was actually one of the trickier ones to get modular to work, but it does go to show that we can make this thing work in almost all cases. The PUD that was set forth, we had very tight guidelines on building widths, heights, and restrictions. So we had to work in a very confined design for this project. With those big cuts, we've got some kind of unique foundation conditions that we had to consider. And it really took a lot of front-end planning and kind of a very coordinated design effort on the front end to pick up our speed on the back end and spend less time in the field for the vertical construction component.
Yeah, I'm excited to kind of get more into that planning process because it really does seem like that is where a lot of the magic happens when it comes to these sorts of projects. So talk me through, you said this was more of a challenging project to go modular on, but why was modular still the right choice in this particular case for this project? Talk me through kind of the decision-making process there.
Sure. There were a couple things. I started with this project about 2.5 years ago with City of Aspen, and I really came on, did the initial estimates that were provided to town council to earmark that money. And then we moved into kind of the means and methods and why we were going to take this path. And the City of Aspen really wanted to reduce the amount of impact to those 2 adjacent neighborhoods, which is all workforce housing deed restricted that are attached to this site. So it was a big reason was speed and picking up schedule, less impactful to the neighbors, less noise, and getting in and out as fast as possible.
So then tell me about those early planning phases then and how that helped mitigate risk and maybe some of the headaches that can occur on the back end. How did those early planning phases go and how important are they to the long-term success of a project like this?
Planning and modular is everything. So the total duration that we're going to spend working on this project is about the same as if we had done stick built. Difference is we're very design heavy and very design coordination heavy on the front end with a shorter time in the field. This particular project, it allowed the city to earmark that money early. It created costs that moved a little bit less on us in a very volatile market. We also locked in that modular contract much sooner than you would have with a typical GC. So we actually selected our modular manufacturer before we selected our GC. And we locked in a lot of those costs up to a year before we actually started building it. So it allowed the city to create a level of certainty on about 50% of the budget, making that cost known and taking some risk off the table early.
That's really interesting. And then from there, did you have to go through the lending process? And if so, what do people need to know about working with banks on projects like this? Is it challenging? Is it easy? But tell me a little bit more about that process of working through the lending process of these projects.
Sure. So both on the Vail projects and Aspen projects, those municipalities work a little bit different. Oftentimes don't go out and bond or take financing routes for these types of projects. It is a for sale project, so the city is effectively floating it on the front end and then recouping on the back. But with my new role at 4 Points Development, we are going out and getting lending for these projects. And there are some hurdles on the front end with lending. You need to make the lender aware, and your cash flows are much different with modular than they would be with a typical stick-built construction. So you are going to have a lot of deposits and different payment schedules for the supply component or the modular component on the front end comparative to your typical stick-built.
That's really interesting. So it sounds like in more ways than one, a lot of effort and planning and things go into the front end of projects like this to make things easier down the road. Is that a correct maybe characterization of just the process of modular in general, that a lot more things are front loaded onto the front end that make life easier on the back end?
Absolutely. I mean, everybody sees it from the street view, which is, the boxes come in, the crane shows up, we put up a whole building in one day. That's definitely the culmination of a year or even more worth of work. And to be honest, going back to the beginning, that's really where I saw the opportunity. Was that first project with Chamonix. There were so many new things and new hurdles that we had to figure out on how to get modular done in Vail because it hadn't been done. And so I kind of took that as an opportunity and said, I'm going to focus on helping other developers and other municipalities through that planning process, through that DRB process, and getting that project from start to certificate of occupancy. And another, big hurdle aside, while we're talking about kind of the constructability and timeline, you have so many people that factor in within that building department that may be unfamiliar with this type of project. So it's not just the building department, it's the fire department. Everybody's weighing in on this, and each one, and then obviously the state will also certify the plans or stamp their portion of the plans. So it's really takes some maneuvering to get through that process.
Do you feel like, being the first kind of modular project like this in these areas, that you maybe have helped kind of blaze a trail and now people have a better understanding of this, making projects like this easier in the future?
Absolutely. And we've seen a windfall of other projects in the Vail Valley that have taken this path after Chamonix kind of opened that door in our particular valley. So then now there's a little bit more known path. For example, I'm just doing projects primarily in Colorado. The state wasn't prepared for how quickly and how big this was going to become. 10 years ago, modular manufacturing was either your typical dealer route, where you'd be buying a single family home, it'd get shipped out and you'd set it on blocks. Or they were building man camps, shipping those up to the oil fields. When the market tanked, they had to get creative, and then it came roaring back and we lost a lot of our labor force in the field. And so when that happened, everybody went into multifamily hotels. And so really what we've been doing now for the last 5 to 10 years is retooling the plants, retooling the labor force, and also retooling building department, fire department to understand how this process works. And so getting into modular now, we've gone through a lot of those learning and a lot of the hurdles over the last decade. And it's much easier now than it was 5 years ago.
That's really interesting to hear. Just that process, I guess, of everyone kind of becoming a little bit more comfortable with the modular process, I think is really interesting. And you've mentioned DRB a couple of times. Tell us about that design and review board phase and the building permit process. How did you walk through those? Obviously, that's a sticking point for a lot of projects. And so, what was that like for you? And tell us a little bit more about that process as well.
Sure. So again, this comes back to doing a lot of the planning up front. We can create these modular components, but then the key to getting through DRB is creating those offsets, architectural articulation in your roof lines, and getting some accents on those buildings. I drive down the road now and I'll point out to people that projects are modular and they can't believe it once it's done. So it just takes a lot of planning up front to get through that process. And then the other piece is that you are submitting both a state package and a local package for review. And getting those two to correlate and getting those jurisdictions to be both on the same page, even that is still taking some extra time here in Colorado, as there are still some conflicts between local and state. So again, planning is where you're going to spend a large portion of your time on these projects to get to that one day when you get to set a whole building at once.
Absolutely, 100%, 100%. The putting the building in place is like the tip of the iceberg in terms of the work that takes place on projects like this. And yeah, you're absolutely right. So, did Guerdon play a role at all in that that DRB process? And if so, what kind of role did they play in making that happen?
So in this particular case, the architect of record was, which was 359 Design. They still spearheaded that process with the city and the local AHJ. Guerdon, on the other hand, like I said, because we were working in these really tight constraints of an existing PUD and two previous phases, basically had to figure out how to get every penetration, intake, windows, elevations, all of these things to work within it, and then go and construct it in the plan. So their heavier lift was in the shop drawings and kind of having to retrofit into that existing PUD.
Bring us up to speed on where things are now, Weston. I know you probably mentioned a little bit about this earlier, but where's the project now currently? Where does it stand, and what's left to do?
Sure. So we broke ground on this particular project in May of 21. We just finished setting our final building. We expect to be mostly out of this project come fall, and we should have our first tenants for the next ski season. So the total duration for the 79 units, we're hoping to keep that to about a year and a half. And I think if we had done this stick built and gone more of a traditional route, we probably would have been looking at closer to a 2-year build on this project.
Absolutely. So are there any maybe final lessons or things that you want people to know about this project, or lessons or things that you hope people take away and can learn from what you've been able to accomplish here?
I think, well, a couple items on that. It really depends on what market you're in and what you're trying to achieve. A project in these cold, harsh environments, I mean, Aspen averages over 300 inches of snow a year. The building season, if you really look at it, is only about 6 months of prime time. So in certain markets, these projects make a lot of sense. Short building seasons, high costs of labor, difficult sites to get to in terms of your labor force, materials. Aspen is not on a supply chain. It's not on ice. It's off of I-70. Getting materials up from Denver is expensive. So it's very kind of site dependent on when this makes sense. But the planning process is really the key to success in modular.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that really comes through as the biggest thing from this conversation, is just how important the planning process is to a successful project overall. So, Weston, what do you see as the future of modular construction? Where do you see this going? As you mentioned, you're seeing more and more projects like this. How do you see this continuing to grow and build as things go forward?
I see a big future for modular. We're already seeing, Marriott Hotels has committed to building a large portion. I don't remember the exact percent, but it's somewhere in that 25 to 50% range of their future projects in high density areas are going to go that modular path. The future of it is going to be anywhere where you've got high building costs, high labor costs. Modular is going to probably be a very good option. The true future, and kind of what myself and some of my colleagues have been toying with and see in the future, is probably a hybrid between panelized and modular, where certain components in the building are going to be modular as we've been doing it. And then other pieces, in order to either hit DRB requirements or to just simply accelerate construction or create things that we can't do in the plant, which is, these big lofted ceilings or like a big entry for a lobby. We can panelize those components, utilize the plant, which already has all the things that we need, which is labor, jigs, an indoor work environment, to create those other components that will then tie into the modular piece. So the future is segmenting your building up, panelizing part of it, putting part of it into modular, and then looking at other things such as bathrooms, mechanical rooms. We're having fabricated 4x8 sheets with manifolds for in-floor radiant heating. We can call and get guys in Ohio to build 50 of those, put them on a truck, ship them out, and then we put those up on the wall, and then it's plug and play. So it's kind of now taking it to that next step and going, what else can we do offsite? What else can we be efficient at putting together?
I love that. I love that. So, final question then is, what's next for you? What's next for Weston Bierma? What after this? After the Burlingame project is over, where do you go next?
So I've engaged with 4 Points funding and 4 Points development, and what we're doing is we have an opportunity zone fund, and we are developing housing, primarily apartment housing, in these opportunity zones in Colorado. So we identify those sites. And I got involved with them because part of that opportunity zone money it's a capital gain that needs to be quickly deployed. So in order to take these funds that have been raised by way of the opportunity zones in the fund, in order to quickly deploy them and have many of these larger scale projects going on, we're going to use modular for about 50% of our construction. We've got about 1,000 units slated to be built over the next 3 years, and approximately 50% of those will be modular. And we're going to do those 50% in about a 36-month period.
Awesome stuff. Weston Bierma. Weston, where can people find out more about what you're doing with 4 Points now and learn more about these projects?
Sure. 4 Points, you can either Google them or go to 4pointsfunding.com. You can find us in the bios. We're a pretty lean team, fairly small group of us. There's only about 15 in total for the whole team. And it really kind of represents the next step in, kind of private development and even somewhat of a partnership to a degree with many of these local municipalities, because we are building workforce housing that's targeted between 80 and 125% of local AMI. So it does take some level of partnership locally. And we're primarily on the Western Slope. So we're sticking to Grand Junction, Durango, Buena Vista, Glenwood Springs.
Very good stuff. Weston Bierma. Weston, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast on Mainstream Modular and telling us a little bit more about this project, everything you have going on, and the future of modular. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Tyler.
Absolutely. And everyone, thank you for tuning into another episode of Mainstream Modular. We appreciate you joining us here today very much. Of course, subscribe to stay up to date with the latest from the podcast. You can do that on any podcast platform, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, wherever you get your podcasts. You can subscribe to stay up to date with the latest and follow along with the show. And don't worry, we'll be back soon with new episodes of the show. But for this one, for my guest today, Weston Bierma, I've been your host, Tyler Cairn. Thanks for joining us.